All right, it's time for another classic album for Classics Month. This one comes from a band that, again, I haven't actually talked about at all on my channel, which is a real shame. For a little bit of context before I dive into it, Graaf Generator for me is a very difficult band to listen to. Not necessarily because of the music that's found within it, even though it is very challenging at times. It's more for where I was at the time of my life when I really dove deep into Graaf Generator's work. I was not in a good place. I was not in a very good place at all. So anytime I revisit it, I'm kind of transported back to that time in my life, and I'm not a big fan of that. So I'm always like, it's always kind of like touching a hot element at times where I'm like, I don't really know if I want to, but people have been asking me about my opinion of Graaf Generator for years and years and years. So I think it's about time to touch that hot element just a little bit as I talk about probably my favorite album from them. So let's dive in. Pawn Hearts from Graaf Generator. So Graaf Generator, I feel, is one of the hidden gems within the progressive rock scene, especially within the early 70s. They don't quite have that same notoriety that Yes, Genesis, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and King Crimson do, even though they kind of came on the scene at about the same time. I mean, their first album of the Aerosol Grey Machine came out in 1969, kind of predating a lot of the big progressive rock works that we know of today. They got quite a bit of critical acclaim with their two follow-ups. The Least We Can Do is Wave to Each Other in 1970, and H to He Who Am the Only One in 1970. Both of these garnered a little bit of critical acclaim, but they never, as I mentioned, they never quite reached the same heights of success that those other bands did. Probably because they're a little bit more challenging. Peter Hamill, the lead singer and songwriter, kind of predated a lot of the punk movement's very aggressive singing style. A lot of people don't like Graaf Generator just based on his voice alone, and it is a little bit of a jagged pill sometimes to swallow. He doesn't have a lot of very big singing, soaring styles, and some people would say he has a terrible singing voice. I think it's just different. And there are a number of moments on this album where his voice is quite heavenly. But for the most part, he has this kind of grating, as I mentioned, almost like punk style of singing. And some of the big notable bands like the Sex Pistols have credited Hamill's voice and vocal works as being part of the inspiration for their style of music. So we can thank Peter Hamill for some of the techniques that punk would use, whether or not you want to. When we come into Pawn Hearts is their fourth studio album, released in 1971, and would be the last one for a lot of fans for a while. I mean, after the release of this record and a little bit of touring, the band kind of called it quits until about 4 years later when they came out with God Bluff. That's just a little aside there, because it kind of goes back and forth. Well, Pawn Hearts is definitely my favorite from them, but God Bluff is just there. It's so close. With the lineup that we have here, another thing that put Pawn Hearts as a different entity is that they really didn't use guitars in their music. Like, they would have the odd guitar here and there, a little bit of acoustic here, a little bit of electric there, but really, at the end of the day, the two big driving forces for this band was the Hammond organ and the saxophone. That was really what was producing most of the sounds on here. And I believe originally this was conceived as a double album, kind of similar to like Pink Floyd's Ummagumma, in that, the first, unlike Ummagumma, the first side was the studio release that we know and love, but the second was more of just demos or solo material or live material, kind of a mishmash of those that were either re-recorded or remixed or repolished to provide the second album. But the record label was like, guys, your first three albums didn't do amazing. Like, Killers from H to He did all right, but let's keep it a little bit more contained. Now, it is also interesting because there are two very different pressings of this album as well. And it's interesting because I first picked up the CD, again, way back in the day, and it was the album that we know and love. But when I picked up when I found the record, it actually has Theme 1 on it as well. And this was something that was released on some US and Canadian versions of this album that wasn't available on the UK, and it was kind of done behind the back of the boys because they had just recorded Theme 1, which was a George Martin track for the BBC, and they just kind of did it to warm themselves up. It was the first track that they recorded within this recording studio, this recording leg, and it was just supposed to be like this fun little one-off that they did, but yeah, and then it was released as a single with another track that wasn't on the album. So kind of place this in the context of where we are. And again, this was 1971, very early on in progressive rock's days. So yeah, what do we got? We've got the two big tracks of Lemmings and Man Erg. Lemmings kind of being this commentary on like following the leader and not really thinking about yourself. And again, this was something that Graaf Generator did very well. Very lyrically charged, very poignant. They're definitely trying to say something on here. And Man Erg is a little bit more of a battle between good and evil, angels and killers, something that they have done before. And again, this was on H to He. But one of the things that I really do appreciate is that unlike the past three albums that were a little bit harder to digest for me, this one, because there's only really 3 tracks on here, it's a lot more digestible. It's a lot easier for me to get into each individual track. One of the things that I do really appreciate is how meaty a lot of these hooks are on this. Like I love with Lemmings where we have that like this was something that, man, these guys were masters of in creating very complex rhythm sections, very complex time signatures, and just playing the hell out of those. I love the rhythm sections of this. I love how meaty it is, but I also love how Peter Hamill's able to kind of bounce back and forth between the very grating, very like menacing singing styles with a very heavenly, very angelic. Neither one is, at the end of the day, all that good, but it does match very well with the instruments that are being used, because I mean, if you think about it, both the Hammond organ as well as the saxophone are both very abrasive, very bombastic sounds. Both are like there's a lot of vibrations all at once, very big, very loud, and so Peter's able to kind of capture that essence and that style within his own singing styles, and both are found very well within Lemmings. And I also love how this band is able to really capture both the heavenly and the menacing. And I already mentioned a little bit of Man Erg and how menacing and heavenly it is, because they are kind of, playing around with the concepts of good and evil, killers and angels. And so when we get into like the beginning styles of this, we have a very lush and very brilliant grand piano lick that we have on there. It's very traditional. Peter is singing with a very heavenly style on there, but out of nowhere we have this screeching stop within the saxophone that just has this bum 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 bum, and so it just like grabs you, gets the hooks in you, and just kind of pulls you along. And that's where Peter just comes in and like he's got that very bombastic and very abrasive singing styles, and man, does it ever like grate on you. Oh boy. But I also just love where this track goes, and it does play with the ideas of the heavenly and the hellish, bringing them both together and just having both kind of be like oil and water, never quite meeting, but always dancing, always moving around one another. And then finally, we're coming into A Plague of a Lighthouse Keeper, the side-long 23-minute epic. Man, does this track slap. I mean, I remember listening to this track and just being blown away by the orchestration of the different movements. I loved how both menacing and heavenly. Like if Man Erg kind of like put the roadmap down for the whole like combination of heavenly and hellish, A Plague of a Lighthouse Keeper is the walking of the path. And I love the storyline. Like it's at the end of the day, it's basically about like this lighthouse keeper that has to witness and watch all the deaths on the shorelines as, you know, he's trying to warn people away from this place and being like, hey, proceed with caution. And people are still going at him anyway. And so he's got this moral idea of like, do I just end it all? Do I like throw myself into the sea and be buried with all these people that are dying? Or do I continue on with the task that I have at hand, trying my best to warn these people about the land that's found around it? And it is kind of left up to interpretation of what course of action does this guy do. It's the music that's found around it, you know, and I love how it jumps from the menacing and gnarly aspects of the tracks into a very heavenly, very beautiful, very somber style of music, blending both the organ sounds and the very crisp and clear piano works with the very abrasive and very bombastic saxophone sounds and licks. Provide just the perfect intersection of music found on this, and the journey of music where we go from heavenly aspect into guttural, like grating sounds, back into heavenly aspects, back into gnarly towns. I love the final moments of this track. I mean, they couldn't have ended it any other way, but I'm so glad that they ended it off on this very heavenly aspect within this more morally gray area of music. So friggin' good. So that's where we've got with Pawn Hearts. I mean, it was a staple of progressive rock music. Wasn't commercially successful. It was not a hit. I think it got a little bit of success over in Italy, but over in the UK, Canada, and US, wasn't necessarily a hit. And I mean, I understand why they kind of called it quits for a while, but retroactively and looking back, this album has garnered a massive, massive fan base, and people continuously come back to it as citing it as one of the progressive rock's massive classics. So if you haven't heard it by now, you need to do yourself a favor and get into it, especially if you're into like a very more like avant-garde style of music, something that's very different, that doesn't just follow whatever everybody else is doing. Because like Van der Graaf Generator was such an odd entity within the early stages of progressive rock, because it didn't really satisfy a lot of those other like itches that a lot of the other contemporary bands at the time were. And so they were the kind of like the forgotten child of the early prog scene. And I am very glad that as we have kind of progressed in time, that this album and this band has looked upon very fondly. Even if when I was diving deep into Van der Graaf Generator's catalog, I was not necessarily in the greatest mindset. But man, when I do get into it, when I'm in that proper mindset that I need to be in to listen to this music, it is so rewarding and it is so heartwarming. So yeah, that's what I've got for Pawn Hearts. What do you guys think about this album, and what do you guys think about Van der Graaf Generator? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Is it a little too jarring? Is it a little too grating? Or is it just the perfect amount of each of their styles? Let me know what you thought about this album by commenting down below. And that's what I've got for you guys today. Hope you're enjoying the more classic albums that I've been covering this month. That's all I've got for you guys today. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.